There are four main criteria for determining if a chemical is a neurotransmitter. One, it has to be synthesized within the neuron. So neurotransmitters are always created or synthesized within the actual neuron. Two, when it's active, it must be released and create a response in the target cell. Three, the same response must be created every time, so it has to be consistent in the response it creates. And four, there has to be a way of removing the neurotransmitter from the action site after the chemical's work is finished, so reuptake or diffusion, etc. Notably, so these are kind of the classical criteria for determining if a chemical is a neurotransmitter. These days, researchers use the term neurotransmitter much more broadly, so you might, if you get further in your psychology career and see neurotransmitter being used more broadly, that's kind of a trend lately in neuroscience. Okay, so we're going to talk about the four classes of neurotransmitters now. These four classes are based on chemical composition. Different books classify neurotransmitters in different ways, so don't be thrown off if you see neurotransmitters being classified as 3 classes or 2 classes, etc. But for the purpose of this class, because it's how your book chooses to classify them, we're going to talk about small molecule neurotransmitters, peptides, lipid transmitters, and gaseous transmitters. Small molecule transmitters are kind of the classic neurotransmitters. Those are the ones you've probably heard about the most. And it includes most of these best known and most studied neurotransmitters. They're quick acting because they're small, and the main components to synthesize these neurotransmitters are derived from dietary nutrients. So this includes things like dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, which is also called noradrenaline, glutamate, GABA, histamine, etc. Quick note, your book goes into a lot of detail about the synthesis of small molecule neurotransmitters. For the sake of simplicity and time in this course, don't worry about the details of synthesis. Just know, in general, small molecule neurotransmitters are derived from dietary nutrients. And this is just a chart with a little bit more information about many of the most common small molecule transmitters. Okay, peptide transmitters, also called neuropeptides, can act either as neurotransmitters or hormones, depending on what part of the body they're acting in, the central nervous system or the rest of the body. As hormones, they respond to stress, they facilitate mother-infant bonding, they regulate eating and drinking, regulate pleasure and pain, and can also contribute to learning. They indirectly influence cell structure and function through synaptic receptors in the CNS, and they typically can't be taken orally as drugs. So some of the small molecule transmitters can be taken orally, so like dopamine, etc., can be taken orally as drugs, but these cannot because they're easily digested within the digestive system. Peptide neurons, you might be familiar with a number of these, so opioids are peptide transmitters. Insulin, and then you might be familiar with oxytocin, which we're going to talk about on the next page. So oxytocin is a neuropeptide that facilitates social bonding. It also plays a role in childbirth and bonding of the mother and child, especially right after birth. And researchers have been looking at oxytocin as a potential medication for psychological disorders in which people are not as prone to social bonding or have social cognition deficits. So one of the more popular diagnoses that this is used for is autism. So oxytocin in the form of nasal spray, because again, you can't ingest it without digesting it too quickly. So children with autism in these studies are given this nasal spray, and it has been shown in a number of studies, actually, randomized controlled trials, that social interaction is improved in children with autism through the regular administration of this oxytocin nasal spray. And I'm not recommending this, but you can actually buy it on Amazon, but I'm not, again, not recommending this necessarily. Okay, so moving on, lipid transmitters. Lipids are a group of molecules that include fats, waxes, some steroids, vitamins, some vitamins. The most popular or most common lipid transmitters that you're going to hear about are endocannabinoids. which means endogenous cannabinoids. These endocannabinoids affect appetite, pain, sleep, mood, memory, anxiety, stress, everything you might associate with cannabis. Endocannabinoids can inhibit the release of both glutamate, which is excitatory, and GABA, which is inhibitory, and we'll get more into that later. Phytocannabinoids, that's like the active ingredients in marijuana, bind to the same CB1 receptors as endocannabinoids, so that's why you get a lot of the same effects in phytocannabinoids, which come from the outside, and endocannabinoids. Two prominent components of phytocannabinoids or cannabis are cannabidiol, which is usually called CBD, and then THC, which actually have potential medical benefits. So CBD, there's some evidence for treating treatment-refractory epilepsy, or epilepsy that doesn't respond to other epileptic medications. And there's actually some evidence, kind of preliminary trials, that indicate that CBD may have antipsychotic effects, so may be effective in treating psychosis. THC has been shown in some clinical trials to help with MS, pain that is mediated by the central nervous system, bladder dysfunction, and a number of other disorders. Notably, there's something called synthetic cannabinoids that are sold as drugs. It's also often called spice, and these are very bad. They are not like endocannabinoids. It's not the same thing as cannabis. It's not the same thing as endocannabinoids. It's usually an unpredictable combination of chemicals, very cheaply and inconsistently created. Side effects can be very serious, including seizure, prolonged psychotic episode, panic attacks, and vomiting. And the effects of the drug, or the positive effects of the drug, are not the same as cannabis. So synthetic cannabinoids is almost a bit of a misnomer and should not be associated with some of the more positive effects of cannabinoids. Gaseous transmitters include nitric oxide, carbon monoxide, and hydrogen sulfide. Nitric oxide and carbon monoxide activate metabolism, whereas hydrogen sulfide slows down metabolism. Okay, so now we're going to talk about receptors. There are two main classes of receptors. Again, receptors are the specialized proteins that are embedded in the cell membrane of the postsynaptic cell. The first class is ionotropic receptor. This acts as a direct binding site for neurotransmitters. It's a pore that regulates ion flow to change the membrane voltage quickly and directly. So a neurotransmitter binds to the ionotropic receptor, and then that receptor also acts as a pore that lets these ions in. And these are usually excitatory, which, if you remember from last chapter, means that they are likely to contribute to the triggering of an action potential. The second receptor type is metabotropic receptors, and this also has a neurotransmitter binding site, but it's not its own pore. So when a neurotransmitter binds to a metabotropic receptor, this the receptor indirectly causes cellular changes. So it might set off a cascade of chemical responses that opens a nearby pore or activates other chemical processes. And this is just another image of the ionotropic receptor, where you can see this red ball is the receptor. It binds to the receptor site, and this opens up the pore, allowing ions to enter. And conversely, in the metabotropic receptor, this transmitter binds to the receptor site, which causes what's called a G-coupled protein, but don't worry about that. So it creates chemical responses that in turn open up a pore, possibly a nearby pore, or it can create a series of chemical cascades which also open up a pore. But the end effect of both types of receptors are the same, that ions are allowed into the cell one way or another. There are different subtypes for each of these receptors. Don't worry about knowing all the different subtypes, just know that there are many different subtypes for both ionotropic and metabotropic receptors, and each subtype has slightly different properties. Receptors are also specific to different neurotransmitters. So there's like serotonin receptors, and there's a number of different types of serotonin receptors, etc.